great morning out there. We want to thank you so much for joining us and spending part of it here on Aspire to Retire with Ralph and Tim Short, the father-son team behind Welcome Home Financial Partners. You can find out more about them online, find out more about the entire team, set up a time to speak with them as well at welcomehomefp.com. That is the website again, welcomehomefp.com. The phone number, 804-635-3550. If you have questions about things we talk about this week on the show, or just questions about your own retirement in general, that's the number. Reach out, set up a complimentary time to come in and speak with them, 804-635-3550. My name is Chris Swan. Today on the show, we're going to talk about how much value a financial advisor brings to the table, and we're going to discuss something that you may have heard about in the NFL, the tush push. We're going to talk about that a little later on, all this and more. But first, before we dive into it, let me check in. Ralph, Tim, glad to be with you once again. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Great Sunday morning.
Yeah, good. Glad to be with you guys. Appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to spend with the listeners. Let's go ahead and talk about something that has been a major topic of discussion, especially here in the area. In the first 2 months of the year, more than 220,000 workers, both in the private and public sectors, they were laid off. They found themselves without a job. A lot of that came as part of the federal government's DOGE initiative. Some of it, again, for other reasons. If a client in their 60s was to come to you guys saying that they were worried about losing their job in the event of, a layoff and they're so close to retirement, how do you help them prepare for, that possible transition ahead of their schedule?
Well, I'll be honest with you, Chris. I mean, we've seen this, right? We've had a fair amount of folks call us over the last few months because of the uncertainty. And I think it's very important, if you find yourself in that position, that you do reach out because the first step that you need to do is assess your financial situation, right? Everybody thinks, hey, I don't need to start planning for retirement until I get, closer, 1 foot out the door. Well, that's not true. We've got to make sure that we've got a plan in place because we never know what the future holds, what tomorrow brings, what the next hour brings for that matter, right? So we need to make sure that we're going to be prepared. I've met with a couple folks over this past week that they found themselves in a position where they relocated because once COVID hit, everything was virtual and they didn't think they were ever going back to the office because they were probably going to retire in the next 5+ years. And now they live 2 hours one way from where their office now is. And now they have to go back in. So they're trying to make sure that they can retire now and not kick the can down the road. And, if they can eliminate the 4-hour travel round trip, that's what they're going to do.
Yeah.
And they're not the only people in that position. I mean, we see quite a bit of folks, but it's not just the federal government. Altria is going through some reconstructing, if you will, with their company. There's a whole lot of companies around that are doing that. And that's where we find ourselves because there's so much uncertainty in the market and everywhere else. So I feel like, if you're listening to this and you are uncertain, you're not quite sure what the future is going to bring for you, you got to make sure that you've got a plan in place. And I think that's something that we could help you out with.
And the thing I always tell people, this is a very emotional time for those people that are either trying to decide to retire or take offers on the table to retire, because you have only one choice, and that is control what you can control. Whatever the government does, you don't have any control of that. So now you've got to take a look at where you are, where you want to go. And it's not a DIY project. I mean, you need some people to sit down with you and give you some advice to, what if you did this? What if you did that? A lot of people will come to us and start talking about taking Social Security early, not understanding the effects that it might have not on their monthly income, but also if you're still planning on working, things of that nature. So it's, it's scary. It's emotional. You've got to take control of it yourself. It's your response to whatever happens to you. If there's an obstacle, you got to figure out a way how to get around it to get to where you want to go. And a lot of people in this day and age, they're receiving a good sum of money on a salary basis, particularly if you work in the government, and they've never taken a look at their budget, where their income's coming from, where their expenses are going. You have to understand that, particularly in your situation that now you don't have a paycheck coming in until you make a decision on what to do. So how much are you going to need to provide the basic necessities of life? And that's what a paycheck's going to do. Those are situations that we sit down and go through our roadmap with, so you can understand, you can visualize what your retirement or what your forced layoff is going to be. It's all about what you're trying to accomplish. Can it work for you? It's not about your neighbor. It's not about your coworker. It's about you and your family, because guess what? Life happens, and all of a sudden, what you had planned for 20 years ago is not occurring. You thought you'd be able to retire from the government job or from Altria or from DuPont. And all of a sudden, life happens, and now you've got to make adjustments. How are you going to do that? Get some advice. It's not just a DIY project. It's never happened to you before. Is it going to happen again? We don't know.
Hopefully, you're in a situation where you don't have to worry about, layoffs like being a prominent concern. But, it's never entirely out of the question. Things get taken out of our hands, and we don't necessarily know what the future is going to bring to an extent. You do know that eventually you're going to retire, whether it is on your own decision, whether it's taken out of your hands and you're forced into that early retirement. What you can do to prepare for that is, well, quite frankly, prepare. Have a plan put in place. See where you stand right now.
And I think one of the other things too, Chris, that people don't consider is their health care cost. What's it going to, where is that insurance going to come from? Are you still going to maintain it? And if you've got health issues, that's a major concern that you're probably going to need to, examine how's the best way to do that. And, it's not one of those things that you should just willy-nilly about making that decision, because all of a sudden, man, you've got some major decision that might happen to you, and you got to make sure you're able to maintain that. And if you're lucky enough to have been smart enough to prepare your retirement by having a 401k or a 403b or a TSP if you work for the government, now what are you going to do with that? If you're under 59 and a half, you might have some situation you want to take some money out. It may not be the best thing, because there's going to be IRS penalties because of that. So those are all things that you need to consider when you're trying to figure out what to do your next phase in your work life, or even in your retirement life, because maybe you can afford to retire before age 65. That's great, but you got to have a plan. You got to understand how it's going to affect you.
Yeah, and talking about retirement accounts, I mean, there's a lot of people that don't realize, what's going to happen when you finally start taking distributions, right? There could be an age factor, there could be a market risk factor, there could be so many different factors that come into play. And if you're not making smart use of those retirement accounts, maybe financially you could retire at 52, but next thing you know, you end up running out of money. And I think that's what kind of scares everybody. But not only that, I think also an issue that a lot of people have these days is they don't know what their budget looks like, right? So we can sit here and say, okay, well, I'm bringing in, as a household, I'm bringing in $10,000 a month. Well, if we say, well, my mortgage is $2,000, my vehicle payments are another $1,000, so on and so forth. And it's like, well, okay, well, you should have somewhere around $5,000 extra at the end of the month. And they're like, well, that's not the case. And I think having a realistic budget needs to be paramount, because if you don't know what you need to pay for it, then how do we know if you've got enough money? So I think that would be step number one. But knowing how to take money out of these accounts, especially if it's raw, especially if it's traditional, there's so many different ways to go about it. And you can make a huge tax mistake or a penalty mistake, if you don't go about it the right way.
I understand, and I think we all understand that budgeting is by no means a sexy thing to do, and no one out there really wants to sit down and do it. But it is critical, because what's worse down the line is finding out that you have been spending more and that you run out of money quicker than you had anticipated. That's the number one fear among retirees and pre-retirees. I've read this before. It's a recommendation in the way that people test drive their car, possibly test driving their budget ahead of time. If they have an idea of how much they're going to be spending, and while they're still in the working world, but they still have, that income coming in, test driving a budget, the year prior to retirement or a couple years prior to retirement to see if that works. Is that something that you guys have heard of before, or something that you guys, recommend for clients that come in that are ahead of the schedule as far as retirement goes?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think it's very important, because anything that you want to purchase or live on, you want to test drive, right? And it's better to do it before you get into retirement. But even in the first year of retirement, there's going to be things that you don't account for. There might be new, hobbies that you bring up that might cost you some money. There could be anything that comes into play. But think about it this way, Chris, we live in the technology world right now.
Right.
And there's so many different apps and trackers that you don't necessarily have to put pen to paper. You can pull it up on an app, as long as you got different things linked to one another and say, hey, this is what I spent last month. This is what I spent the month before. For the whole entire year, this is what I've spent on these different categories. So to me, there's not really any kind of excuse for you not to know what your budget is. You just got to put in a little bit of effort to do that. but the tracking capabilities of certain apps are, pretty remarkable. And most credit card, apps have tracking abilities too. So I think that is an easy way to set up your budget to actually see what you're currently doing. Now, the other part of that is what can we trim back if need be? I think there's probably not a whole lot of people that we don't sit down with that don't bring up their Amazon bill and they're not quite sure exactly, what that looks like. So, of course you can't account for everything. Not everything is going to be perfect, but let's try to hone in on those numbers and get it as accurate as we possibly can, because it's not just about paying your expenses, right? You want to make sure that you can live the lifestyle that you want. So that's going to take money, whether you just want to hang out at the house or whether you want to go on trips, travel, whatever. So if we need $5,000-$6,000 just for our expenses, let's make sure we've got some more money coming in and do the fun things.
But I would say to most people, it takes effort on your part, whether it's a lot of effort because you're going to do it the old-fashioned way, pen and paper, or whether it's the new-fashioned way with an app that tracks it. You still have to take the time to get things started, to understand where you are, because you can have it on pen and paper, but if you're not paying any attention to it and you say, oh, that's all right, I'm just still going to continue to doing what I'm doing, and you're $1,000 a month short on your income versus expenses, it may not be the type of retirement that you had planned on. And particularly if you're forced into doing something like this, and now you're, as the old saying goes, you're up the creek without a paddle. It's time to sit down and figure out where you want to be and if you can get there. And that's what you were talking about, Chris, just a minute ago. Is let's test drive it. And that's just basically saying, all right, I've got $5,000 I want to live on. How am I going to spend that $5,000? It takes a little effort, takes a little brain power, but it's well worth it, because guess what? At the end of the day, you want to have that lifestyle you always dreamed of, but also you want to be able to sleep at night. Hey, I've done the right thing. I'm good to go. So let's have this happen. Now, the other thing is a lot of people may be able to retire, and all of a sudden they don't like retirement. Mm-hmm. They are tired of not doing anything, not having a purpose or a mission in life. Just because you can't afford to do that doesn't mean that's what you really want to do, because guess what? There's only so much golf you can play. And don't get me wrong, Tim, I know that you don't agree with that, but there's only so much of that you can do, so much TV you can do without saying, hey, I am bored out of my mind. We have clients coming in after we have this conversation a year later and say, man, you were right. After 3 months, it's like, I don't know what to do with myself. Okay. There's only so many honey-do lists that I want to do anymore. It's just one of those things that I have to do, but I want to do something else. So I want to go back to work. I want part-time. I want to do this. I miss people. That's the number one thing that a lot of people forget. If you don't have any outside interest and you don't have as much social interaction with people, it does affect your mental status. So that's something else that we always sit down and talk to people about, whether you're forced to retire or you want to retire. Those are issues that you need to do.
Yeah, and we've got a client who lives out in Farmville, and he worked for a railroad, and he's now been retired for just over a year. And he came in a couple weeks ago to go over his accounts, and he goes, well, guess what? I'm going back to work. And I go, okay. He goes, I'm bored. And the funny thing with him, though, is he can keep himself busy. He's a tinkerer. Like, he's working on a couple patents for different machine things that are kind of out of my league. But I didn't think he'd be the type to go back, because he's always got something to work on. And he goes, no, I'm tired of sitting at home. His wife still works. So she's gone the majority of the weekdays. So he goes, you know what? I'm going to go back working part-time for a trucking company. I said, fair enough. No, you don't have to. And he goes, no, I know I don't have to, but I want to.
And that's the goal, ultimately. If you do unretire, there's nothing wrong with it, but it should be out of choice and not out of necessity. And if you have a plan in place, hopefully you can make that into reality. Maybe you don't want to unretire, and that is certainly your prerogative. You can stay retired and fill that with as much golf or whatever it is that you want to do. By the way, the amount of golf holes I would play before it became a strain on me, probably like 2 or 3. I'm not very good. But, you want to have a plan in place, whether it is a retirement that happens ahead of schedule by choice or out of your hands, or, you want to unretire. Again, hopefully that's more out of choice and not out of your hands. But having a plan in place is critical. Having that retirement roadmap put together for you and help you navigate these uncertain times, because as you said, Ralph, you've probably not retired before. The goal is to make sure that you don't have to unretire unless you want to, and that you just hopefully get to enjoy that. It all starts with reaching out. You can go to welcomehomefp.com. Right there on the front page, right below, right there at the top, actually, it says, begin the retirement roadmap process. You can reach out. You can also find out more about the entire team at Welcome Home Financial Partners. Or you can give a call, 804-635-3550. This is not the meeting, this conversation that you have right now. This is just to get on their schedule for the week or the weeks ahead. Find a time that's convenient for you. Again, 804-635-3550. One way that financial advisors like yourselves get paid is by charging a, quote, assets under management fee. In other words, they get a certain percentage of the portfolio they manage every year. On average, that cost is usually around 1%, but it might be lower if the balance is larger. And that brings up the question, I think, is it worth paying a financial advisor 1%? It comes back to that value question that we talk about so often. How do you answer that question?
Well, I think we get this question all the time, right? What are your fees? People, before they even say hello, is what are the fees? Everybody, anybody who's listening, and I know there's going to be some people that agree and some people that disagree, but, we want to keep as much money as we possibly can. So most people are shooting for the price tag, right? They want to see what the price tag is before they get into it. You've got to find the value. Now, what is value? It's going to be different for each person. I think most people, as they're getting into retirement or in retirement, you've got value with having a team behind you, right? There's going to be situations that you're not aware of, opportunities that you potentially could have that you're not aware of. And I think having the ability to have more than just one set of eyes on your retirement accounts is value. So that could be something provided, but also too is always revisiting where you are, right? Because life's going to change. Right now we're living in change, probably more than we've seen in a concentrated time frame than I can remember in recent history, right? So making sure that you readdress any kind of issues that could potentially come up, any changes to your lifestyle, any changes to your health, any changes to anything, and then kind of reassess. And I think that's where a lot of people don't realize that they're just taking a look at, hey, I got $2 million sitting in my 401k. I'm fine. Well, what if there's other opportunities out there where you could either maximize income, you could have some tax strategies, or, you could simply earmark some money for leaving legacy? Because most people nowadays, they're leaving all their pre-tax or all their retirement accounts in pre-tax vehicles. And, they're going to have that ticking tax bomb, if you will. And if they don't need the money come 73 or 75, whatever they're going to end up changing the law to if they do, they're going to have to start pulling money out of these accounts. And I had a conversation about that this week. It's, we want this account to grow, but also too, we don't want to get to a point where we're pulling out $200,000 for an R&D in a year, because that's just going to kind of throw everything off. So there's a lot of things out there. There's a lot of issues out there. It kind of goes back to the old thing of, if you've got a medical issue, you're going to a doctor. You're not going to go to a mechanic. You're not going to go to your neighbor.
Right.
So you've worked in your industry for how many years? And yes, you probably have done well on your own, right? We've built up this big pot of money, but now at some point you need to have a team kind of reassess where you're at and where you need to be.
I would say this, Chris, it's not about how much it's going to cost you to do that. Like you say, it's the value. So let me just explain something that just happened this week with a couple of situations I've run into.
Okay.
A gentleman that's a client of ours that decided to kind of take some things on his own because his wife had passed away and she had done all this stuff. And he's kind of, into a situation where he's never been before. And he's in his 80s. Okay. So we're trying to make some changes and stuff for him. And he decided to do a couple things, and he called me and asked me about them. So I went down, sat with him, and went through some paperwork that he gave me. And I'm like, where did this account come from? Because I've never seen it before. Oh, it's just a piece of paper that came in here. And I said, okay, well, it's an IRA that you didn't inform me that she had. So now we got to take that and move it over into your name before we can do anything with it. So we started that process. Long story short, we'd gotten it changed over to his name, and he'd gotten a letter, and he called back into the company and said they told him he needed to cash it out. And he sent the paperwork back, and then he called me and said, I'm not sure why they told me this, but I don't know what I did. And I'm like, oh my God. I said, this was an IRA, so you're going to be taxed on it. He said, no, they told me it was a life insurance and I wouldn't have to pay taxes on it. I said, listen, it's a $150,000 IRA that you just cashed in. You're going to have to pay taxes on that whole amount in one lump sum. So my question to you is, that's going to be roughly around $60,000 to you in taxes. Ooh. So we need to get this straightened out. So after 4 more hours of conversations over the next week, we kind of got it straightened out, but it didn't have to be that way. So my question to you, Chris, and to the audience, was that worth his percent that he had to pay me to get $60,000 back? I believe it is.
I would say
but you have to answer that question yourself. That's the value of what a fiduciary financial professional is here for.
And it's important to know, exactly. We've talked about fees before, and if you don't know what you're actually paying, it's difficult to assess the value of the team at Welcome Home Financial Partners, Ralph and Tim Short. They are transparent. They will have that discussion up front. I mean, if you do ask it before you say hello, that is your prerogative. But it is a conversation that is important to know. And I think it's funny because, here we are on a show that is very much a financial show. And it is one of those things that is taboo for people to talk about, politics and money. But of course, when people come in, they're going to want to know these questions. And do people come in sometimes and not ask how you guys are paid or how much it's going to cost because they think that is gauche or just taboo to speak about?
Yeah, I mean, it happens from time to time, but I think more often than not, the fees come up in the first meeting. But everybody knows, when they come out and they sit down with us and we go through our retirement roadmap process, it doesn't cost anything to go through that. So some people, kind of wait for, the second meeting to say, hey, what is all this going to cost me? And then we talk about, depending on what we're recommending, we'll bring up the fee structure.
And what I always tell people when they ask that question in the first, whether it's before we meet or during the first meeting, I'm say, well, it's kind of hard for me to tell you what it's going to cost you when I don't know what I'm going to recommend for you, because this isn't a situation where everybody gets the same thing. It's based on what you need, what you're trying to accomplish. So for me to sit there and say, well, it's going to cost you this, when I'm going to say it's probably going to cost you this because this is what I'm recommending. So I was telling them, once we make the recommendations and you decide which way you want to go, then I'll tell you how much it's going to cost. Until then, it's kind of a moot point because we don't know what we're going to recommend for you.
And I think another thing of importance too is, we kind of pride ourselves with being, legacy advisors as well, if you will, right? So, our clients, we get to know their beneficiaries, we get to know their kids, their spouses. And I think a lot of people get very comfortable in knowing that, hey, if they're no longer here or they're incapacitated or what have you, that their advisor knows them well enough to where they know what they're looking for. Obviously, hopefully we've got some estate planning pieces put in place, right? So POAs and all that. But just knowing the fact that, hey, Ralph or Tim or whoever at the team knows me, knows what I want, knows about our situation, knows the family dynamics. And I think that provides another value too, because the last thing you want when you're on death's door, if you will, is to not know what's coming down the pipe as far as financial wise. So I think once again, having that team in your corner is a very good value.
But also I would say to a lot of people, I mean, yes, if you're married, probably one of the others probably taking the responsibility of handling the financial affairs. Is that fair enough to say, Chris? I mean, usually that's what we find in our clients. But what I would say is, if the one that handles the financial affairs is no longer here, what's going to happen? Because I know a lot of people that their wives handle it perfectly fine, but a lot of them don't want to handle it. They let their husbands do it. And now all of a sudden they'll say, well, when you're no longer here, honey, who's going to take care of me? Who's going to make these decisions? So that's, like Tim said, that's the reason we like to understand what their goal is so we can help the next generation, whether it's your wife or your husband, or whether it's those spendthrift kids of yours that are always spending money all the time. That does happen. I know you're too young, Chris, to have kids that always asking you for money, but that will happen to you one day. Okay.
I mean, my son is 9, but he's got pretty expensive taste these days. But the loss of a loved one, whether it is, your spouse or the matriarch or patriarch of the family, is already an emotional time. If there is that confusion with what happens next, are there affairs in order from a financial standpoint? What about X, Y, and Z? Are there going to be tax implications that I need to think about? These are not things that you should worry about, while you're in your mourning period. And it is something with a proper plan, as you guys said, legacy planning. We're going to talk a little bit more about estate planning later on in the show, but that helps. And I think that comfort is a value in and of itself. And I think a lot of people out there, I think, can see the value of that, but it's a conversation worth having. And again, the retirement roadmap process, as you mentioned, Tim, it begins, it's complimentary. There's no cost to come in and sit down and speak with you guys initially. All you have to do to reach out and get a feel for, the team at Welcome Home Financial Partners, see if it is something that they want to do or that you want to proceed with. All you have to do is reach out 804-635-3550. And Ralph, like you said, you can't just give a bill right there when they walk through the door and say, this is what it's going to be. It's not a buffet. It's not, you're paying $9.95 when you walk through the door and you're going to get to pick and choose what you want to do. It's more of an a la carte thing. And so, but putting it together and then getting an idea of what it's going to look like in total before you sign and commit, that is what you get at Welcome Home Financial Partners. Sorry, we did go, I think, 2 weeks without talking about food, Ralph.
Yeah,
I had to bring it back.
You had to bring it back.
I did. It all comes back around. But again, 804-635-3550 is the phone number. The website, welcomehomefp.com. As always, we appreciate you joining us, spending part of the day here on Aspire to Retire with Ralph and Tim Short. Hope you have a great week ahead of you. Hope you stay safe out there. Gentlemen, appreciate the time as always. And as we wrap up, I do want to leave you with the final word.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and we appreciate your time as well. But we've talked a lot of uncertainty and a whole lot of change going on, estate planning, Roth conversions. These things are very important and can be very important for your retirement plan. So, if anything you heard today kind of struck a nerve, if you will, give us a call. We'd love to see what kind of value we can provide for you. We bring you into the office and we can create your very own retirement roadmap. But pick up the phone, give us a call, visit the website, attend one of the First Friday events. We'd love the opportunity to meet with you. So we want to thank everybody for listening and take care.
All content is for information purposes only. It is not intended to provide any tax or legal advice or provide the basis for any financial decision, nor is it intended to be a projection of current or future performance or indication or future results. Opinions expressed herein are solely those of Welcome Home Financial Partners and Welcome Home Wealth Advisors, LLC. The information contained in this material has been derived from sources believed to be reliable, but is not guaranteed as to accuracy and completeness and does not purport to a complete analysis of the materials discussed. All information and ideas should be discussed in detail with your individual advisor prior to the implementation. Each individual investor's situation is different, and any ideas provided may not be appropriate for your particular circumstance. Advisor services are offered by Welcome Home Wealth Advisors, LLC, a registered investment advisor in the state of Virginia. Being registered as an investment advisor does not imply a certain level of skill or training. Insurance products and services are offered through WPI Holding, Virginia Insurance License Number 138509, an affiliated company. The information contained herein should in no way be construed or interpreted as a solicitation to sell or offer to sell advisory services to any resident of any state other than the state of Virginia or where otherwise legally permitted. Welcome Home Wealth Advisors, LLC and Welcome Home Financial Partners are not affiliated with or endorsed by the Social Security Administration or any government agency.